Dialectic thinking is the type of thinking used by the ancient Greeks to try to arrive at the truth, right? And what that involves, at least for them, was to not be too excessive or to be too deficient in any particular belief or action or position or mental state, right? So it's this idea of not being too extreme in one place or the other, but rather to go somewhere in the middle, to moderate yourself. And they saw this as a way of being with regards to all their virtues. So here's a chart, right? So let's take the example of courage, right? Courage to the ancient Greeks was not to be, if you have too much of it, you're foolhardy, right? You're reckless. You're going to put yourself in too much danger. But if you're lacking in courage, right? If you're too cautious, well, then you're a coward. So to the ancient Greeks, being able to take risks and calculated risks where you have increased chance of survival, or you're going to, achieve something that's really important, and not completely reckless and wasteful, would be the golden mean between the deficiency of cowardice and the excess of foolhardiness. If you look at this virtue chart, you can see that they talk about all these other virtues as the midpoint or the moderation point between the excess of something or the deficiency of something. And this was all throughout, their society, and even in their mathematics, right? The golden mean is a thing that shows up in math as well. So dialectic thinking is something that we're going to use, but we're going to modify it a little bit, right? In the 1700s, there's this guy called Hegel. He's a German philosopher, and he applied this ancient Greek dialectic model, and he modernized it, right, for the sake of arguments and for logic, right? So let's go over that a little bit because it's what's going to be useful for us in class. So you start with what's known as a thesis, and then from there you find the antithesis or the antithesis, right? The thesis is the initial claim, belief, perspective, or position. And then what you do is you go to the extreme end and you think of, well, what would someone say against this, right? These are the counterclaims, the oppositional beliefs, the contrary evidence, and opposing positions. And what you do is you consider both, and then, through a process of figuring out what's valuable, what's important, and what's practical, and what people will believe, you come up with a new argument that's a combination between the thesis and the antithesis or the antithesis, and we call that the synthesis. And this becomes a new thesis that incorporates the consideration of both one side and the other. So it's like this blending of the two. It's this midpoint, right? So let's take a look at this in a really generalized example. And the important thing to remember about dialectic thinking is that it is an ongoing process. If you are a logician or a philosopher, according to Hegel, this is something that you just do all the time. You're constantly refining your beliefs, right? So let's pretend you have X belief, right? You could sit there and say it's useful, and then you think of all the reasons why it's useful, but then in order to make yourself or your belief better, you think about all the ways that it could possibly be useless. Take the opposite position in your brain and then find the midpoint between the two, and you'll probably end up with something like X is useful sometimes. And then you become a little bit more specific. X is useful when Y, but it's also useful in situations involving Y, but useless in other situations. It's harmful when Z, and then is useful when Y, but harmful when Z. And then eventually you're just refining a particular belief, right? So what happens in your head is that you take the two extremes, you blend it together, and then hopefully you come up with some sort of midpoint that works and makes sense, okay? So let's take a look at a more specific example, right? Let's talk about exercise, right? Destroying parts of your body is bad, right? But exercise destroys muscle to make it grow back stronger. So maybe, destroying parts of your body isn't always bad. So destroying muscle during exercise is good, but destroying too much muscle during exercise is bad because it won't grow back as much as you had. But exercise can grow as long as you don't overtrain. And then if you eat and sleep, that's what actually grows muscle. So let's refine our argument. Exercise is good for growing muscle as long as you don't overtrain, eat right, and get enough sleep. and on and on and on and on. As you get more information about your health and about body and about exercise, your beliefs about your body and about exercise should become more and more specific and more refined with more and more data and more facts, right? And for Hegel, it's to sit there and to constantly be growing, to constantly be evolving your beliefs and your arguments, so that if your beliefs and your arguments never change when you receive new data, well, that's not very logical, and that's going to hinder you from growing, right? So you're always constantly moving back and forth between one extreme and the other to eventually refine your belief system to the point where you just keep doing it forever and you just become a better human being and a better thinker, right? And dialectic thinking is something that's really important for our class and for our society. Okay, so that's something that you need to keep in mind. We're going to be dialectic thinkers in class, and we're constantly going to be challenging ourselves to think not only about our beliefs and our position, but to think about what the other side might say as well, and take the valid parts of that and refine our existing beliefs. All right, high five for learning.